This is English 385-12, Early Modern Lexicon. We're going to try for a calmly paced, not too tightly packed 20-minute lecture on this one. So I'm making an effort to speak slowly. I hope I can keep it up. We'll find out. Fair warning also, there are a lot of distracting sounds that are happening right now. My apologies for that in advance. Smith and Kim's opening of the chapter you just read on early modern English is one of the most eloquent moments in the book, I think. You'll remember how they talk about how the idea of Englishness changes dramatically in the early modern period, which shifts the very orientation of maps like this one. Did you notice, just looking at this map, that it has England at the dead center? That dramatic change that Smith and Kim talk about is not an unusually sudden shift in the form of the language itself. Setting aside the supposed great vowel shift for a moment, we'll talk about it later, while the early modern period witnesses an unprecedentedly massive increase in the number of words in the English lexicon, at the other levels of language variation, it witnesses a relative slowing of change. We have the emergence of the printing press, which serves as a brake on changes in graphics and phonology, while the rise of grammarianism puts new limits on the variation of morphology and syntax. The dramatic change that Smith and Kim are talking about is English's mainstream idea of itself. Prescriptivism and changes from above, including that of the lexicographers and grammarians, become conceivable during this period at a global scale. Correct spellings emerge during this period, and with them for the first time, silent letters. Correctness in grammar becomes a thing. Right? There were conversations about the proper way to write or form sentences before. Most of them had to do with Latin, but really that becomes a thing in English in a real sustainable way in this period. English thus becomes self-aware in a way it hadn't been before. The English language begins during the early modern period for the first time to position itself as something more than just a local vernacular alternative to Latin, let alone a local backwater vernacular alternative to Latin. England was not that, it was a major player, but it was not that major a player on the world stage in comparison to what it would become later. Right? English in this period becomes something at the center of its own map, even as the map of English expands radically. But there is an important date that I'd like you to know that Smith and Kim don't say much about. I've lost my place. That Smith and Kim don't say much about. It is in 1588 that the English Navy registers a major military win. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. From a country that had previously, that is, the Spanish Armada, from Spain, which had been previously unmatched as a naval superpower. On the map I've been showing you, and by the way, these dates in big print that we've been looking at are the dates you should know. You'll notice that right toward the end of the 16th century, that is, after 1588, the spread of English via English colonialism moves outward from that center. In 1600 to India, in 1607 to North America, 1655 the Caribbean, Jamaica at least in particular, 1672 West Africa, and then from there we get another sort of circle surrounding that here in the southeast of the map, with 1788 in Australia, 1806 in South Africa, 1819 in Singapore and Malaysia, and then the United States establishes its own colony in the Philippines in 1898. At the root of this historical sprawl, which also sets off, 1588 sets off the defensively purist moves of lexicographers like Johnson in 1755, and then the counter move by Webster in 1789. I'd say at the roots of all these is in many ways the sea change that 1588 brought by establishing England as a naval superpower, because it defeated, somewhat surprisingly, the then current naval superpower, Spain. The growth in lexicon that the period witnesses is the most visible and lasting result of that change in self-conception. As Seth Lehrer puts it, English at this time in effect, defines itself as a word language. And the business of much 16th and 17th century scholarship becomes the business of defining. Dictionaries emerge in this period as guides to this new lexical landscape, as if language were a brave new world akin to that of the explorers or the colonists. Put broadly, the combination of emergent empire plus print culture plus the always ongoing shifts in language change has two opposing results. On the one hand, you have the rise of attempts to control that wild new growth of language by, emerging for the first time, grammarians and lexicographers. But at the same time, second, and somewhat opposed to the grammarians and lexicographers, you have what Lehrer calls a general idealizing of copia and amplificatio. That is, copiousness and amplification. The idea fundamental to English mainstream culture that bigger is better, which characterizes much of the rhetoric, fashion, art, and grabby, greedy politics of the period. To quote Lehrer here, and again, this is Seth Lehrer from his book Inventing English, an excellent book. He writes, "Great buildings," this is the highlighted part, "great buildings, great speeches, and eventually great empires would grow during this period. And like the sumptuous dress that clad the courtiers of such monarchs as Queen Elizabeth I, the English language itself could be clad in what the rhetorician George Puttenham called, in his 1589 Art of English Poesy, quote, rich and gorgeous apparel. We could, he argued, quote, polish our speech and, as it were, attire it with copious and pleasant amplifications and much variety of sentences, all running upon one point and one intent." We're talking here about dressing up our way of speaking for its own sake, about adding more and bigger and fancier words because that is taken as a value in itself. The connection between that grabbiness of a lexical phenomenon and colonialism should be apparent. And thus, the influx of new words into a language newly excited by, especially from the top, by the very idea of having and owning a lot of words is unprecedented. This is another bit from Lehrer. This is a chart that isn't about, where new words come from, nor about how the words got there, which are the two OED charts I've already shown you. But this is simply a chart of how many new words arrived in the years here spanning from 1475 to 1800. The influx of words had never been that high, and never would be again. Contrary to pop culture reductions, Shakespeare himself wasn't responsible for the influx of so many words into the language. I think there's a lot of pop culture reductions of things that suggest that Shakespeare invented all of those new words. Incorrect. But he did witness it happening in his lifetime, and he sometimes did contribute to it, but he also mocked it. Let's look at one way that he witnessed those changes, say in 1598's Love's Labour's Lost. I'll draw our attention here to a conversation between those comically arrogant characters, Nathaniel and Holofernes. We looked at this actually briefly in Zoom discussion already, whose speech headings in the first printing here are just curate and pedant, so Nathaniel, Holofernes. We've already looked actually in the Zoom session at some of what Nathaniel says. A companion of the king's, actually I'll just read what he says, because we have time. Taken time. "I praise God for you, sir. Your reasons at dinner have been sharp and sententious, pleasant without scurrility, witty without affection, audacious without impudency, learned without opinion, and strange without heresy. I did converse this quondam day with a companion of the king's, who is entitled, nominated, or called Don Adriano del Amato," right? So here, as we mentioned in class, he can't just say whose name is. He has to say entitled, nominated, or called. And Holofernes responds with a rant about his dislike of Adriano here. You can feel just how obnoxious Holofernes is. Second paragraph. He says, "Novi hominum tanquam te," throwing in the Latin for, I know the man as well as I know you. "His humor is lofty. His discourse peremptory, his tongue filed, his eye ambitious, his gait majestical, and his general behavior vain, ridiculous, and thrasonical. He is too picked, too spruce, too affected, too odd, as it were, too peregrinate, as I may call it. So that's obnoxious. Or to take wording from our most recent Zoom session, it gives him a feel of sounding both posh and very icky at the same time. Look at the words he's using. Thrasonical. What the heck? I thought this would stop happening. There we go. Thrasonical. A Latin borrowing, which only appears in writing in 1564, only 34 years prior to the play's publication in 1598. Or the 20-year-old majestical, first used in 1578 by affixing ical to majesty. It's only clipped to the word majestic later. Or spruce, which in this usage, a shift in denotation from the tree and other things similar, which in this usage is only recorded as early as 1590. The word isn't even 10 years old by the time the play is published. Even the word ridiculous had only entered the language in the year 1533. So that makes the word ridiculous at this point in Holofernes' mouth only 63 years old. It would feel in 1598 usage the way that words like meritocracy, metatext, and Anglocentrism might feel in my mouth now. Those are words that entered the language in 1956. They're 63 years old now. In short, I think you've picked up that Holofernes is obnoxious specifically in a way that means he's tossing out buzzwords here, especially new words and Latin borrowing words. His friend Nathaniel, the curate, zooming out. I think I just... There. I tried to fix all the problems. His friend Nathaniel, the curate, also tosses about similar buzzwords. Remember, he says audacious, quondam, nominate. Audacious and nominate, as common as those words might feel right now, were direct borrowings from Latin. Why can't you just say name? How do you have to say nominate? Nominate just meant name before. Now it has undergone semantic shift to mean something else. But nominate is from Latin nomen plus ate, meaning to give a name, which English already had a name for. It was name. Both of these enter the language only for the first time in the 1550s and 40s. Same thing with quondam, which is just quondam, direct from the Latin, which in this usage only comes in circa 1540. Same thing with scurrility. So in short, we're tossing around new Latin buzzwords here simply to dress up the way we sound, without any gain in how well we are understood. And in fact, with a loss in how well we understood, to the degree where Shakespeare is essentially just making fun of us here. And Holofernes isn't done. This speech goes on. And this time when he goes for Adriano, to make fun of Adriano, this time he goes specifically to mock Adriano's use of language. I quote here. The pedant says, "He draweth out the thread of his verbosity." Verbosity is from 1541. "Finer than the staple of his argument. I abhor," that's actually a new word too, I think. "I abhor such fanatical phantasms, such insociable," 1591, "and point devise companions, such rackers of orthography." A pause on the fact that he calls Adriano's spoken words a racker of orthography. You should know why that doesn't quite line up. Notice that Holofernes is about to criticize Adriano for not pronouncing words the way they are properly spelled. Oh my gosh, I just spilled something. For the words they are properly spelled. So he criticizes Adriano, continuing here. As to speak doubt, the word doubt, fine or fine, he might be saying fine here. As to speak the word doubt, I've lost my place. Oh, right, here we go. As to speak the word doubt, when he should say daubd, debt, when he should pronounce debt, D-E-B-T, not debt, Interestingly, both of these complaints that he makes are hypercorrections. They are ahistorical hypercorrections that are in this period trying to force English spelling and indeed English pronunciation into Latin, even though those words were borrowed via, I think, via French, and never historically in English had the B sounds in them. Right? So Holofernes' history is wrong. But he's criticizing him for being ahistorical. How about he Klepeth calls a calf a calf, right? He doesn't pronounce the l in calf, which once was pronounced. Half, he pronounces half. Neighbor, vocator, I can't even do it right. I think Holofernes means to pronounce the word neighbor, vocator, neighbor, right? So we're saying the pronunciation that Adriano is using is the one we currently use. But he's saying it should be nay, which is abbreviated to nay, right? The sound is a sound we'll talk about, but it's represented by that GH. And his opinion of this? This is abominable, which he would call abominable. Again, he's making fun of Adriano pronouncing words wrong, but this is another ahistorical hypercorrection. This time it is actually a folk etymology based on the then current and still maybe current misconception that the word abominable, as in abominable snowman, comes from the Latin ab plus homine, away from man. It doesn't actually come from there, so adding an H to abominable is not historical. But this is abominable, which he would call abominable. It insinuateth me, insinuateth, or insinuate, 1529, of infamy. And actually, some editions have of insany here, as in insanity, but insany, which is a word from 1538, and so forth. Holofernes is a parody of a certain kind of pompous, learned man. He's a man who piles on the extra wordage as decoration, and who delights especially in decorations that are Latinate or Greek sounding. It's John Bale who in 1543 comes up with an apt name to make fun of this nonsense. The name is Inkhorn. Inkhorn terms. It's early modern copia and amplificatio at their most extreme and their silliest, but it's also where we get many of the explosion of new words that enter the language in this period, including some of the synonyms that Cassia got us talking about at our last meeting. Inkhorn terms. Latinate or Greek-ish words, usually loan words from Latin or sometimes words modeled on Latin, or also on Greek, more often Latin, added to English usage in order to elevate the style of writing, to have a more classy way of saying something, often for concepts which already had ordinary English equivalents, and which only afterward might take on connotations of profanity or lower class style as a result of the contrast. Look at the words that get added in this rough century. We get the word lexicon in 1603, where word hoard was doing just fine from the Old English. We get osculate, which we talked about in our Zoom session, which is just kiss. We get invigilate, familiar to us at U of T, which means stand guard. We get urinate, which means just piss. Corporeal, related to bodies. Exterminate. Copulate. We had already had the word fuck. And we also had sweeve, by the way. Lactation. Notice we can't talk about these physical bodily functions like lactation, copulation, urination, defecation. We all have these polite words, these medical terms to talk about these things, newly entering the words, the lexicon now. We have emporium, where store would have done fine. We have conflagration, which just means fire. And toward the end of the period, we have utilize, which is very new relatively. It's 1807, which just means use. And among the early Inkhorn editions, too, are two words we've come across already, and I'll close with these. We have philology, first used in 1522, which means essentially from the Greek philo and the Greek logos, love of words, which can mean, depending on whom or when you ask, the study of language, especially historical or comparative, the study of literature, especially historical or comparative, and now most often we use it to mean the study of language as it is used in literature, or specifically the historical study. And we get for the first time the word lexicography in 1658, which means the writing of dictionaries. So do you use inkhorn terms? There are still so many words that we use in present-day usage which really mean something simple, but which users want to dress themselves up with in the lavish clothes of early modern pomposity. Lavish clothes that, I'll remind you, were knit from the threads of colonialist, exceptionalist, classist, and Anglocentric grabbiness that make possible for the first time a truly global separation of how we talk in here from how they talk out there. How often do conversations at university dress themselves in these borrowed clothes, including conversations aimed ostensibly at decolonizing or equality? How often do you, to quote George Orwell's excellent essay on politics in the English language, how often do you use a long word where a short one will do? Notice I said use, not utilize. When you do use words like this, why do you do so? And as Orwell would ask, oh, I'm at 21 minutes. What does that unnecessary inflation of your vocabulary do to your ability to speak and think clearly? Are we continuing to make Holoferneses of ourselves?